Welcome to Faith Talk with Val
and Sony.
We are a Bible-based podcast where we talk about real life, real struggles, and how faith makes all the difference.
So we'll start off today with a verse, Proverbs 19:21, and the verse says, "Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails." So I have a question for you. Do you think it's possible to still fulfill God's purpose, but take the hardest possible route to get there?
Yes, I am a victim of this, and I think a lot of us are victims of this. As we're going to see in this episode, God's will is always fulfilled in the end, but the route to get there is completely dependent on our journey with Him and how obedient or disobedient we are. Reflecting on my life, I'll give an example. And I may have shared this in a previous episode. So you know how there's children's church for kids and you're supposed to go and like your kids go out. I had a very strict grandmother who did not basically let me go to children's church. I had to stay always and like listen to the sermon. Thank you now in retrospect. But in that time, we had a bunch of missionaries come out, and I specifically saw this one missionary couple that went up. It was the wife. Now that I'm saying it, I think I have mentioned this before.
Oh, okay.
But who knows? Who knows? But anyways, so she's talking about how they are doing missions in Honduras, and it's something about building wells for the community. And I remember listening to that and like watching the joy that just came out of her face as she's like expressing this. So much joy. I want that. I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to be a missionary. I want to experience that. Like, I just knew that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. But there's really like no track to become a missionary. And then I just like forgot about it. It was like a lost dream.
Adulting.
Adulting, go into like corporate world, working. And then years pass and that dream becomes a little less attainable, almost like something that was a dream, also out of sight, out of mind. You get older, you start to have like commitments. So there's certain things that just don't seem feasible anymore. This was one of them. I like to bring this up because God's will and what He plants in your heart, it will come to fruition one way or another. So at this point, I think I ended up going on this mission trip when I was in like my late 20s. And when you're in your mid-20s, you're like, okay, this isn't like, I can't just like, this is college stuff. I can't just like stop my life and like go do this big thing. But I did. And God allowed a way for me to like leave my job, go on this mission trip, and then come back to that same job, which is absolutely insane. And the reason I want to bring this up when you said, is God's will still done, but you can take like the hardest way possible? In that I did take the hardest way possible, because when I was working, I stressed out about my job every single day. If I did well, I was like thinking about job security. I was thinking about like metrics and quotas and everything. And that never left my mind. And maybe I didn't express it, but inside I was like, it was like a constant numbing fear that kind of just like stayed as an undertone that you could say muted my life a little bit. This thing that just hovers over you. And I feel like it is like doubting God's ability to like work in your life. When I left, a really interesting question that I was asked was, do you ever regret anything from like your job, from working? And I was like, yes, I regret not trusting God enough. I regret not trusting Him in job security, in the fact that He's going to provide, in the fact that even with any type of escalation I run into in my job, it was something that He allowed for me to experience. And He was going to take care of it if I only had brought Him into the situation. I didn't view my life that way. I didn't view my job that way. I didn't think I had access to God in that specific way. As you get older in life and you like experience more life, I think you start to realize that you don't have to worry. I took the hardest route possible in that sense, in terms of like the peace that I experienced. I robbed myself of peace throughout my life, worrying how my life was going to end up, what I was going to do, if I was going to accomplish certain dreams or not accomplish certain dreams, only to end up in a point where God says, don't worry, when you turn 27, you're going to be a missionary and you are going to travel internationally, and not just like for 1 month to go on like this 1 month mission trip. I'm going to literally take you across continents for a whole year, and you're going to leave your job. You're going to leave on your own terms. You're going to come back. And once you come back, you're going to come back exactly where you left off. And when you come back, I'm going to ramp you up.
And I think a key point to add to this is when you came back, the confidence you came back with, because you were gone for a whole year doing God's work.
Mm-hmm.
You were building homes and preaching and doing all of the things out there for those people in need. And when you came back, you did come back with like a sense of security and seeing like all of the blessings that you did have here. I mean, I hate to say it, but like even in comparing what people in those countries live through every day.
Yeah.
And I know when you came back, you talked about getting back into the company and just your interview process. So tell us a little bit about that part.
Yes. So when I was coming back, and I think this is common in a lot of different companies, sometimes you have to start over. And I had worked my way up in tenure to the highest level that was possible when I left. So I was initially going to start off at the lowest level. If I had not asked for anything more, that was like exactly where they were going to keep me. And I was thinking like that was fine. But then my parents were like, no, you worked really hard to get here. Don't you think God can bless you and help honor all the hard work you've done? There's no way you're starting over. But I think that's where wiser voices lead you, because they have more experience, they know more about the world. So when I was going into that interview process, they're like, where do you expect to be? And I was like, well, just to honor where I left. And they were like,
we don't do that.
We don't do that. We can't do that. The exact words used were, there's no precedent for that, so we can't make that happen. Okay, then it's just not meant for me. Just like that. It's not meant for me. It's absolutely fine. I didn't need a couple days. Like, I knew that wasn't something that I was going to negotiate on, and not because of anything about like what you deserve or your worth or none of that, but it was simply because of my story. And my story was, when I left, I regretted not trusting God enough. And I said, if I ever were to come back, I wasn't going to make that same mistake. So one of the questions that they had asked me, why do you think you were so successful before? And one of the things that I said is, I'm successful because God makes me successful. I truly 100% believe that. Like, give glory to God. I think if you give God the glory, He will provide more opportunities for you to give Him the glory. One of the things they asked me was, another reason why that's not possible is because you just don't have the pipeline. We just don't think you can ramp up in the amount of time needed. Valid point. But I do believe God can ramp me up. I have to believe that God can do that for me. Like, He took me out of here. He's bringing me back in. If this is His will, He will do it. And I think I've mentioned this before, but sometimes we don't put God in the hot seat because we know that we have to sit there too. And what if God doesn't come through? Then we look dumb. God's like, okay, so you're already doubting. We cannot allow any place for doubt. You have to be so sure. I believe that God could ramp me up in the 3 months. And that was really gutsy for me to say, because in our line of work, that's not a light statement. That's not something that you just throw out there.
Like, you're committing to very high goals.
Yes.
In the time frame that's usually allotted for much smaller goals.
Yes. Like, you're setting yourself up for failure. But I knew that that's the kind of testimony that I would one day give. So I had to go in full faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, if this is going to happen, it's going to happen full faith because God will get the glory from this. They basically said, think about it. I didn't actually hear back. I just kind of said no. And then that was it. And a couple months later, they contact me again and they're like, we want to do an interview type thing. And I was like, I've already gone through this. And I guess I'm going to go through it again. And I was like, sure, why not? They come back to the same question. How much do you expect to be paid? I guess this is the point where they thought,
this was like the final test. Like, will she stick to her guns?
Will she say like, no, I'll take whatever you can give me? But the thing is, like, I had already set my mind on something and I wanted to give people a testimony. And there is no testimony in settling for something that is not going to require God to intervene.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times in life, we have the opportunity to invite God into things. If something in your life is currently risky and involving Him is the reason that makes it risky, that's not risk, that's faith.
Yeah.
So in that, I was like, I expect my tenure to be honored.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, next question. And I was like, wait. In my head, I was thinking, that was it? That's it? Like, that's what we're going to do? We're just going to run with it? I got so much pushback before, and now it was like doors open.
The reason why I wanted you to share this story is because I remember those days where you would stress out so much, and you were a high performer. Like, I remember thinking, like, how is she doing this? And every time you like trained anyone, the first words out of your mouth were, I pray over it, I give it to God. And then you would go into like the technicalities. And I remember people would even be like, oh my gosh, just tell us how you really do it. And your answer was always firm. I give it to God. Mm-hmm. But between you and I remember you're like, I give it to God. He provides every time, but I'm so stressed because next month, because next week, because X, Y, Z. And like, there was always this sense of dark cloud hovering over the success, even though God had proven to you time and time again that you were successful in your role. And then when you left, I remember it being like such a relief. Like, you're like, I'm not going to stress every day and I get to go do God's work. And coming back, I just think that story is so amazing because coming back, you came back with confidence. Like, you know what? God does provide. And you know what? God has a purpose. And if it's His will, it'll come to be. Mm-hmm. And I just think it's so amazing how that story literally shows that when it's God's will, it'll happen and everything just falls into place the way it's supposed to fall into place.
Yes, I love it. And in that note, now I have a question for you. Do you ever wonder if you can mess up God's plan for your life?
That's a really good question. And there's 2 stories that I want to share. 3 technically, but I'll let you tell the last one.
Okay.
So the 2 stories I want to share today are the story of Samson. And we've told the story of Samson from a different angle before, but I think it also works in this specific scenario. So the story of Samson, I'll just recap it for you guys. Samson is one of the most dramatic figures in the Bible. So his story is told in Judges chapters 13 through 16. And it shows both God's power and the consequences of human choices. So his story begins when Israel was being oppressed by the Philistines, and an angel appears to a barren woman, the wife of Manoah, telling her she will have a son. This child would be a Nazarite, which meant he was set apart by God. God says Samson will begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines.
And that's Judges 13:5.
And part of the instructions the mom was given, to bring God's purpose to be was don't cut his hair. Because ultimately that was the source of Samson's strength. So don't cut his hair, no drinking wine, no touching dead bodies. So, as Samson's life unfolds, some of the cool stories that he's known for are killing a lion with his bare hands, defeating 30 Philistine men on his own. There was one that's pretty cool where he catches 300 foxes and he ties torches to their tails and burns Philistine fields.
I feel like that's even impressive for today's age.
Yeah. And he also killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Like, this man's strength was insane.
Wow.
And all of those victories, God was working through him even though Samson was known to be impulsive. His weakness, despite all of that strength, was making poor choices. He often pursued relationships with Philistine women, including Delilah. The Philistine leaders bribed Delilah to discover the secret of Samson's strength. And after repeatedly asking Samson, finally he tells her his strength is tied to his Nazirite vow, symbolized by uncut hair. And so, of course, Delilah tells the Philistines, and in his sleep, Delilah cuts his hair. So his strength leaves him, and the Philistines capture him. And basically, it became a story of humiliation. They gouged out his eyes, they put him in prison, they forced him to grind grain. And in one of the lowest points of the story, they bring him out basically to humiliate him. There's like this big festival or feast going on, and they tie him to 2 pillars just to humiliate him. Like he's there for show, basically. And so during that large celebration honoring the Philistine god, Samson prays one last time to God, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please strengthen me just once more." So God answers his prayer, and the one thing they forgot is hair grows back. So his hair was growing back, and therefore he was regaining strength, and he'd gained just enough strength for this final act. So Samson pushes the 2 pillars apart, and the temple collapses, and he kills more Philistines in his death than during his entire life. Unfortunately, he also dies in that downfall. Main takeaway, God said Samson would fight the Philistines, and he did. But his personal weaknesses led to that tragic ending. He could have continued to be this strong, courageous man, but instead he gave in to those temptations. He was disobedient, he drank, he gave away the secret that he was supposed to keep about his strength and his hair, and he fell victim to the Philistines. So in the end, God's will still prevailed. The Philistines were still defeated through Samson, but how it happened could have been different.
And I think that's like super important to note, because a lot of times people are like, God allowed these bad things to happen to Samson, but God gives us free will.
He had multiple opportunities, but he continued to drink, and in that drunk slumber blurted out things to Delilah. And each time he would say, fake things. He said many different things to her, and they were all lies. And each time she showed her true colors. And the Philistine men came and attacked, but his strength was still there, so it didn't matter. But that final time he said the truth, she cuts his hair off, and he opened the door to be attacked.
And I think that also brings up the question of, we need to be super diligent and faithful and disciplined in our walk with Christ, because the devil doesn't give up.
No.
Like after the first attempt, like sometimes I feel like we go through one test and we're just like, okay, we're set for life.
Yeah.
We can put our guard down. But Delilah like literally came after him time and time.
Diligent in the attack. Yeah.
Yeah. And he had to be diligent every single time, and he slipped up in the end, and at the end it was his downfall. But I think that is why it's super important to like abide in God every single day and say like, today could be my downfall.
Yeah.
Like
obedience is key.
Yes. I'm humble enough to know that just because I aced yesterday, or it was like amazing, or I held my own yesterday, it doesn't mean today you will.
Yeah.
And Samson's like a reminder of that.
Yeah. And the other story I want to share is the story of Jonah. So I don't think we've actually talked about the story of Jonah yet in past episodes. And the story of Jonah is actually a warning. Jonah was a prophet, and he was called by God to go warn the people of Nineveh that they needed to change their ways or destruction would come. So a little backstory, that the people of Nineveh were Assyrian warriors, and they were known for extreme violence and cruelty. So Jonah thought they deserved to be punished. And also he's probably thinking like, you want little old me to go warn those crazy warriors that they need to change their ways? Like, there was fear behind it. There was disobedience behind it. Ultimately, God said go right, and he went left. he did not follow God's orders. And so he gets on this boat to basically escape. And once he's on the ship, there's a huge storm. And like this boat's about to go under. And the fishermen on the boat are like, pray to your God. What is going on? And finally they realize, you're the reason this boat's about to go under. So they throw him overboard. They're like, you gotta go. And so they throw him overboard. And when they throw him overboard, the Bible says a large fish swallows Jonah. So he's in this fish for 3 days before he finally repents and asks God for a second chance. So this fish takes him back to Nineveh, where he was supposed to be in the first place. And he has the opportunity to warn the people, and the people actually repent and they do change their ways. So at the end of the day, he was fighting against God's will because he wanted his own will. He wanted them to be punished. He wanted them to suffer the consequences of their cruelty. But you have to think about God's grace. And I think that's an important piece too. They were cruel people. They were awful people. But God's like, I'm going to give them one more chance to change their ways before destruction comes. And Jonah was trying to take away God's mercy from their path. But the important thing is God's plan always prevails. His plan always unfolds. And the only thing disobedience changes is how difficult the path is before obedience finally happens.
I love that. Because you're right, obedience does finally happen in the end because God's will is always done.
Yeah.
So something that just popped into my head when you were explaining it, because I think we mentioned this in a previous episode, and right now I'm like seeing it again. We talked about the importance of the company that you keep. And you had mentioned Jonah was inside of this boat and the whole boat was suffering because Jonah was disobedient. So what did the men do? They kicked Jonah off of the boat. It reminds me how sometimes there's places that we need to go, that God calls us to go to specific things that we need to do in our life, but we don't realize why we're stuck.
Yeah,
we don't realize why we're suffering. And sometimes, like we've seen this in scripture happen again with the story of the girl who, I think it was Tabitha, or maybe not Tabitha. It was the girl who Jesus was on his way to resuscitate her. He was like, everyone leave the room. Only leave the mother, the father, and then who he came with, so they can pray over the girl and have her come to life. We see God removing people in order for this miracle to happen. Here, we see the men on the boat. What had to happen for that boat to stabilize? Jonah had to be removed from the boat.
Yeah.
So as you were telling the story, I'm like, oh my goodness, that comes into mind. Like, maybe this episode's meant for someone listening to this. If your life is not headed in the direction you feel that it's supposed to be headed, that God is calling it to be headed, look at your boat.
Yeah.
Is there people that God is like specifically pointing out in your life that need to be removed? Not for your peace, not for anything specific, but for your journey with God to flourish.
For his purpose.
Yeah.
That's such a good point.
It just like, as soon as you were saying that, I was like, oh my gosh, there it's again. The removal of people in order for God's will to happen.
Yeah. And I think that's sometimes a really hard concept because we're stuck in the concept of how we think it should be, just like Jonah. Jonah thought they should be punished.
Yeah.
And so therefore we think, oh, this is the path that I think should be. And so we're sitting there battling. We're fighting a losing battle because, again, the whole point of this is God's will be done and God's will always prevails. And I think I forgot to mention this in the beginning. So you can find that story, the story of Jonah, in the book of Jonah, chapters 1 through 4.
Yes.
So I want to add, I actually have a little note next to those chapters in my Bible. And it says, God speaks to us and guides us every day. We cannot run away from his will. If we try to avoid him, we end up a long way from where we were meant to be.
Oh, I love that.
So this brings me to the story of Joseph. And I know we've talked about the story of Joseph in past episodes, so we won't retell the whole thing. But what I want to emphasize is we just listened to 2 stories of disobedience. In one, Samson ends up dead, but God's will is still done. In the other story, Jonah's disobedience leads to a delay of God's purpose. But in the end, God's purpose was still done.
Mm-hmm.
The story of Joseph, on the other hand, is a story of obedience. And in Joseph's obedience, there were blessings.
Even though he had a very rough path. And I think it's important to note that just because you're obedient doesn't necessarily mean your path is not going to be rough.
Yeah.
But we do see God's mercy and specifically working in Joseph's life to train and equip him to be able to handle
where he was exalting him.
Yes.
And so the verse that comes to mind for Joseph's journey is Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And I have a little note next to this verse that I think fits perfectly here. And it says, God does his greatest work in the hardest places. We learn and grow more through pain than through comfort. If you accept the pain that comes with loss, you can grow. You will only grow through your ability to push through the pain. And I think Joseph's story is a perfect example of that. He continued to push through the pain of the circumstances that he was placed in. And in the end, God used that for God's glory. But in that, Joseph ended up being the second in command of the nation through his obedience. So I hope today's episode was a blessing for you all in understanding the value of obedience when God calls you to something, when God calls you to let go, when God calls you to stick something through, when God calls you to a specific purpose. There is value and less pain in following where he's leading you instead of trying to take matters into your own hands.
And we also hope it brought you a little bit of hope and confidence in knowing that you can't ruin God's plan for your life in that too. Whether there's a lot of disobedience in your life written, even if you're up into a point where you're like, I took every wrong turn, we also want you to know that the Bible shows us that you're going to end on the right turn.
Yeah.
So the journey may not always be what you want it to be. You can always rewrite the journey. God works everything for the goodness of his will.
Yeah. We're one decision away from being obedient and pursuing his path for us.
Yeah. And this was Faith Talk with Val
and Sony.